It is officially fall, and it has been for a little while now, but it's actually getting cool outside. I have a list of clothes and items I want to make for the fall and winter season. I don't know which of these I'm more excited to make. The Sherpa vest looks more simple to do, so I'm going to start with that. It's not cold yet, it's just chilly, so I think this vest is going to be perfect for now. And my favorite thing about it are these ties on the side. I think that's such a cute little detail. The Sherpa they're using on this vest looks like double-sided Sherpa, so there's Sherpa on the outside and the inside of the fabric. My fabric that I found only has the Sherpa on the one side, so I am going to line my vest with a nice soft knit fabric. Also, the collar is cut into one piece along with the button placket, so there's this collar piece attached to the button placket, and there's this side attached to the button placket, and then there's the back collar attached to that back piece. I was going to do that on my vest as well, but I only got half a yard of fabric. So I'm going to cut my collar separate from those pieces. So I'm going to cut the two button plackets. I'm going to cut the front collar separate. And then I'm going to cut the back collar and that back piece separate from my vest. So those are going to be the differences in my vest. I got 2 yards of this Sherpa fabric, 1 yard of this lycra, and 3 yards of this twill tape for the side ties. For the pattern, I'm taking the front and back pattern pieces of an existing basic jacket pattern I already have. I'm going to cut 4 of these 3-inch width button placket pieces, and I also took the seam allowance and an inch from the center front pattern piece to make room for the button placket. I went and extended the shoulders 2 inches on the front and the back. And I almost forgot, but I also lowered the armhole by an inch on the front and the back pattern pieces, so the armholes of my vest would be wide enough to comfortably layer underneath the vest. I'm trying to figure out exactly how they did their pockets, because it does not look like the pockets were sewn on top of the fabric. These pockets look like inlay pockets, like they cut the shape of the pocket out of the front pieces of the vest, and they sewed the pockets into those cutouts. They have these at Dick's Sporting Goods. That's not too far. Sometimes to figure out how things are sewn, you have to see them in person, or at least I do. So I'm going to take a drive, and I'm going to hope that seeing it in person helps me figure it out. That trip helped. I feel like I got it all figured out now. So let's try and see if it makes sense. So I started by drawing the shape of my pocket onto my front pattern piece. I just copied the shape of the pockets on the Free People's vest. And I'm going to cut this out 1/2 inch from the line I drew like this. I'm going to cut 2 of these from my Sherpa fabric. Then I'm going to take this piece here I cut from the front pattern, and I'm going to cut 2 out per side, so 4 altogether. From my Sherpa fabric, only I'm going to add that 1/2 inch back to the perimeter. That is an important step. If you are making this vest, you have to add that 1/2 inch back to the perimeter. So this is what I have for one side of the front. The pocket pieces are cut the same, not mirrored, and I cut out 2 of these per pocket, 2.5 inches wide, matching the shape of the top of the pocket pieces from my lycra fabric. And I also cut 1 pocket piece from this knit fabric from my fabric stash. This was cut mirrored to the other pocket pieces for the inside of my pocket, like how it is on the Free People's vest pockets. I pressed interface into these lycra pocket pieces and pressed up the bottom 1/2 inch seam allowance, and I'm going to sew 1 to the top of the Sherpa pocket pieces like this, and the other to the top of the knit pocket piece. Then I'm going to sew the knit pocket piece to the other Sherpa pocket piece right sides facing along the top edge. I pressed and stitched that seam toward the knit fabric and stitched the 2 together around the other edges. And now I'm going to sew this to the other pocket piece like this. So knit side facing the Sherpa of the other pocket piece around the sides and bottom edge. I serged those edges, and here's how my pocket is looking. And now it's time to insert this into that cutout. So I cut into the corners of the front piece like this, and I used a light heat setting on my iron to press the seam allowance in like this. And I'm going to sew each side to the pocket one at a time, starting with this side over here. I folded over the front and lined up the side of my pocket with the side of this cutout, and I sewed the two together. Once that was sewn together, I did the same thing with the other side. I used clips to hold the two together, and then I sewed them. And then the same thing with the top edge of the pocket. Once I had all that sewn together, I top stitched around the perimeter of the pocket just outside of the pocket. And I repeated all of that on the other half of the front. And this is how my fronts are looking after inserting those pockets. It's looking a lot like the Free People's, so I'm feeling real good about this vest so far. I went and cut out the back of my vest, and I'm going to sew the fronts to the back along the shoulders and the sides, I'm only going to sew halfway down the sides. Now I'm going to go and add this little back piece here to the vest. For this piece, I just cut a piece of fabric from my lycra fabric on the fold. I matched the neckline to my back pattern piece's neckline and cut it about 7.5 inches long from that center back neckline to the bottom, and about 3.5 inches wide on the fold, so that's 7 inches across the bottom. Added interfacing to this and pressed in the seam allowance like this. I pinned this to the back of my vest, lining up the necklines, and added in a 3-inch piece of twill tape at the center like so, and stitched all that in place with 2 rows of stitching. And this is how it's looking so far. A little bit different than the Free People's vest, but I like it. I pressed interfacing to my button plackets and sewed those on right sides facing. Once those were on, I went and measured the neckline so I could add a collar to this vest. I took the measurement of my neckline and I cut that out by 3 inches from my paper. I went and slashed into the collar like this. Then I went and taped those slash edges, overlapping them until the top edge of my collar was 20.5 inches long. Last of all, I split my collar into 3. The 2 ends I cut to match the measurement of my front neckline, and the middle I cut to match the length of my back neckline. And I made sure to add seam allowance on those ends where I cut the collar. I cut 2 sets of each of these for the inner and outer collar, pressed interface into each piece, and sewed these together. And now I'm going to sew it to the neckline, right sides facing, lining up the side seams. I cut 3 rectangles from my Sherpa, all 3 inches in height, but 2 of them by the length of the top edge of my front collar pieces and 1 by the length of the top edge of the back collar piece. I sewed these together right sides facing, and I'm going to sew this to my collar, but first I went and trimmed down the back of my collar so it's shorter in the back, and I'm just making sure to line up those side seams when I sew this on. I cut out 2 fronts and a back for my lining fabric. For the fronts, I cut out this bottom lining piece from my lycra fabric, 2.5 inches in width, and I pressed in 1/2 inch at the top edge before sewing that on. I cut out this piece for extra reinforcement at the sides. It's 2.5 inches by 4 inches. This actually should have been about 6 inches, so 2.5 by 6 inches, which you'll see why later. But I pressed in the side and top edge, and I'm going to sew that on here. Then I went and stitched the armhole interfacing directly onto the lining, which in hindsight, I think I should have added that later after the lining was already added to the outer vest. But anyway, I did stitch that directly onto my lining. I created this armhole facing by tracing the armhole of my pattern onto my fabric and measuring 2.5 inches from that traced line to create the width of the facing. And last of all, I'm going to add my button placket. And then for my back lining, I sewed on this back centerpiece, that bottom piece, which again, I pressed in the seam allowance at the top edge, these little side pieces, and the armhole facings. Then I sewed the fronts to the back along the shoulders and again halfway down the side seams. I sewed on that second collar I made earlier, and I made sure to cut that shorter in the back too so that it matched the outer vest. And I'm going to sew the outer vest to the lining vest. If you've ever sewn a lining to a vest, you know that there's a method to it. And if you do not go about it that correct way, you will not be able to turn it right side out when you're sewing everything right sides facing. I already have the bottom sewn together right sides facing. I have the top sewn together right sides facing. And I would love to sew the armholes together right sides facing. But if I do that, I will not be able to turn this right side out. I don't know why or the mathematics behind it, but I know it would not work out. So I'm going to sew along the button plackets together, and then I'm going to turn everything right side out. And for the armholes, I'm going to hand stitch those together. So I'm going to turn over the edges once everything's right side out, and I'm going to stitch the lining armhole to the outer armhole. That's kind of a hassle because the sewing machine would be much faster. At this point, it just has to be done this way. I went and base stitched the edge of the facing to the outer vest before stitching that in place with my sewing machine. Next, I top stitched along the top edge of those bottom pieces here to create the casing for my drawstrings. Now I realized that I wanted to sew mine higher than the interfacing pieces I added there, but for actual reinforcing, these should go about an inch or so higher than the side slit. Since my split is higher, I'm going to sew above this. Here's how it looks once I stitched all that in place. And the reason why my tie strings are missing is because I seam ripped them out because I felt like they were too light and the colors were clashing. So I decided to do a little tea dye. I just boiled some water and added a black tea bag in there and added my tie strings in for 10 minutes before washing them. So this is how my tea dye drawstrings came out. It's not really a match, but I feel like this is the closest I'm going to be able to get it to the vest. And you know, this is not a perfect match to this, so I feel like what's one more color, right? I'm going to go and press these with the iron, and I'm going to sew them in, and I'm going to hope for the best. I'm gonna hope that it all looks good together. I added my tie strings back in, double folded the ends and stitched that in place, and I stitched my back tie in place at the center. Then top stitched around the entire collar and button placket to complete my vest. Oh, and I almost forgot, I went and added my favorite hammer-on snap buttons.